Think of the worst boss you've had. What made them so bad? Do you think their top career goal was to be seen as a horrible boss? Or did they simply lack the training, skills, and self awareness to learn and grow in their role? Today, we dive into the topic of bad bosses. We look at the sobering stats around employee engagement, financial impact to the business, and the scary mental health impact that often results from toxic bosses and workplace cultures. My guest today is Rob Kalwarowsky, an MIT-trained mechanical engineer turned leadership coach. Rob shares the eye-opening journey that led him from the world of heavy industry engineering to leadership coaching, along with important lessons for employees and bosses in today's rapidly changing leadership landscape. Welcome to the Working Well podcast, the show that explores the rapidly changing landscape of work and well-being. Each episode, we dive into the hottest topics of leadership, employee well-being, and the future of work. I'm your host, Tim Borys. Now let's learn a little bit about Rob before we jump into the interview. As an MIT-trained mechanical engineer, Rob Kalwarowsky spent a decade in mining, oil pipelines, and heavy industry. His experiences with toxic leadership led to serious mental health challenges and set him on a mission to positively transform leadership and employee experience. Rob is passionate about building a world where happiness and engagement at work are common. People are led by great bosses. Rob was a three-time academic All-American in NCAA water polo. He played on the U18 Canadian national water polo team and is now a world-renowned leadership coach and trainer. His TEDx talk on how to deal with an asshole boss comes out this spring. Rob, so great to have you on the show today. I'm looking forward to diving into a few different leadership topics with you. Before we get started, what's been new with you in your world?
Well, actually, Tim, I'm out in Alberta, just like you are, for the last few weeks. We're just getting all the paperwork ironed out to be back down in Costa Rica for an extended period of time. So I'm ready to get back down into the tropics because the snow is not working for me.
Oh, it's almost springtime here. I don't know. In Calgary, we were plus 11 yesterday, so
Yeah.
that's basically spring. But it's probably not as warm as Costa Rica.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I know, like, we lived out in Edmonton for a long time, and it was like 11 is perfect for the spring. And then now that we live mostly in Costa Rica, it's like every day is about 30 and sunny. And so you're just like, I never worry about what I need to wear. It's always the same thing.
Well, it's different experiences in Costa Rica versus Calgary and Edmonton. Well, when we're talking about leadership, you've got a very interesting background. You came from the, I guess, heavy industry, mining, oil pipelines, and consulting in the heavy industry aspect. So what got you into the leadership side?
Yeah. So it's actually because of that is why I do what I do now in leadership. So I guess a little bit further back. So I played water polo for the junior national team in Canada, went to MIT, got a mechanical engineering degree, and then my first job was in mining and coal mining in BC. And I went out there and I was like, let's go. Like, let's save some money. Let's go on that corporate career track. Like, let's get going. And I saved my company a lot of money. It was tens of millions of dollars in the first year I worked there. And I didn't know all the leadership stuff. So I was just like, I'd learned my whole life, hey, post results, people will like you, and then you'll get opportunities because of this, right? Like when you play sports, if you score more goals, play well, people like you, you get on better teams, whatever. Or like in the classroom, you get A's, your teachers, your parents are all excited about that. And then you kind of move up. This was the inverse. And so I saved all this money and I was like, hey, promotion time, like give me more money, get me like recognition, da, da, da. And it was like, whoa, no. And there was a lot of pushback. And it was a lot of this elements of like, well, we can't change. We've always done it this way. And then my boss was also very passive aggressive. And so there was things like, it now looking back at it, it's like he had a lot of the ego mindset stuff that we work on with folks. But it's like, well, I hired this guy. He figured out that what we've been doing was wrong or could have been improved. And like, it's on me. I look bad now. And so I'm going to deny this and I'm going to push that away. And for me, I mean, that landed in my experience as like, well, you don't want me to work here. And so that put me down a track of I suffered with depression and I had a suicide attempt in 2013. And then basically, like, I worked for the next 6, 7, 8 years, just sort of drifting. Like, I wasn't really trying that hard. I wasn't really pushing because I felt, I guess, inside that if I did that, then I would get hit down like I did in my first job. And so I changed jobs, moved, did all the things, but I kept seeing the same things. Like in consulting, I went to, 60 facilities across North America, everything from mining, oil and gas, manufacturing, power plants. And I kept seeing folks that were working there. They were incredibly intelligent. These guys had worked there for 20 years. They knew everything that was wrong in the facility. And yet they all had the same thing. Well, I told somebody else, 5 times, no one ever listened. And so now I just keep all this information in my head and they're all negative and they're like, change doesn't work and this doesn't work and nobody listens and blah, blah, blah. And then I started working with Susan actually for my own growth. And what she started to teach me was like what leadership could be. And that started turning the lights on like, actually, you know what? It's like this industry has a leadership problem. And it was because of that is why I was unhappy and why all these other folks were not only unhappy, but they were also like the performance was bad. Like, how can you work in a facility and you have this guy who knows all these things that are wrong and you could fix all these things and you would save millions of dollars and then you don't want to do it? Like that always boggled my mind because I would always try to find that guy and be like, hey, tell me what's wrong in here and like, we'll fix it. And of course, that was my limited perspective at that time. And now as I've pivoted into leadership coaching and like I don't work in heavy industry. I think I have one client who's in heavy industry, but now I have clients across the board. And it's very pervasive throughout the world. And the research backs this up. Like I did a TED talk about how to deal with an asshole boss. And the research shows that 65% of the workforce works for what's known as a destructive leader. And there's 6 types of destructive leaders, but we'll get into that maybe later. But it's like, this is pervasive across industry. And it's all the population from the government to private to all these companies. And it's not only is impacting our personal health and well-being as people, it's also impacting the business results.
It goes back to that saying that people don't leave the company, they leave their boss. And I'm shocked that the number was that high. I knew there was lots of bad bosses out there. And I guess I shouldn't use the word bad boss. Ineffective bosses or bosses leading from, well, they're not leading, bosses dictating from the ineffective perspective, we'll call it. And you said something earlier in one of your articles is that very few people really set out to be a bad boss. So how do you think that there are so many out there? How many people having a negative experience in the leadership role?
Yeah. I mean, Tim, it's what you said, right? Nobody sits down at the job interview and they say, hey, Tim, where do you want to be in 5 years? And you say, I'm going to be the greatest asshole boss of all time, right? it never happens like that. Like typically everyone wants to do a good job. Everyone wants to feel like they're productive and that they're getting things done and that you know, their job has meaning and it's useful and all these things, right? And it's flat out basically two reasons if you distill it way down. One is the psychology that people have, and the other part of it is they don't learn leadership. And the second one is Harvard Business Review reported that the average person becomes a supervisor at 29 years old, but they don't receive leadership training until they're 42. 13 years. Right? And Tim, like, you know, you're a really incredible baseball player, and it's like, imagine you just learned it on your own for 13 years, and then you're like, oh, you're drafted by the Yankees, we're going to give you a coach now. It's like,
Yeah.
that's insane, right? And it's like, we don't do this with any jobs. Like, you know, it's like when I was a lifeguard, I did training. My sister worked at Wendy's. She was doing training. Like, we're giving training to folks to do these jobs that are not as necessarily impactful on other people's health and well-being than leadership. And yet we just go, hey, you know what? You're a great salesperson. Now you're managing people. Or, hey, you're a great engineer. Now you're managing people. And it's like, well, the skills to be a great engineer are not the same skills to be a great leader.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you bring up a great point. We tend to see that. Well, there's a saying where people get promoted to the level of their incompetence. And we tend to see that, from my perspective, a lot more in the technical skills, engineers, lawyers, doctors, things like that, that people show exceptional technical prowess and they're doing really well. And it's like, hey, now we'll just make you a leader of other technical people. And yeah, as you said, with the skills that get you to be successful as a technical producer are not the same things that it takes to lead people. And that 13-year gap is tremendously impactful, because after 13 years of quote leading, you're probably not as malleable as you were at the beginning of the process. And if you manage to survive that long, you build your habits. And the framework that I try and bring into my coaching clients and my consulting is what I call the mindset first and then the habits. Until you shift that mindset and become a learner and realize that there are things that you can do to improve, and you're able to look critically at your actions, your behavior, the outcomes, nothing else will change from that. And you know, I love how you brought the sports into it. You must have seen that as well in the water polo side. Is you start to build these skills as an athlete and as a team player that are so transferable to business. And there's a reason that a lot of the most effective leaders come from a sports background. And because you learn those skills, and you might not be trained in them in the business world, but you've had enough experience building that up throughout your formative years that you're able to step into leadership roles more effectively and create positive outcomes. When we're talking about that 13-year gap, what do you think needs to change to start to erase that gap?
The first thing is companies need to invest in their leaders sooner, right? And
But I guess
yeah.
what, in order for them to do that, what mindset shift or what operational or strategic shift has to happen?
The big shift, right, is we need to just look at the research and to behave in ways that science has already proven are effective, right? And it's like Gallup does their state of the workforce every year. And every year it's, you know, in 2023, I believe they released one, and it was, we have all-time highs in employee engagement at 23%. Right? And it's like, that means basically 1 in 4 people on your team are actually engaged, doing their work as the best they can and like pushing. And there's like a big percentage there, around 60-ish%, where the folks are, that actively, or sorry, was it actively quit, passively quitting, whatever the word is now. But it's like
quitting.
basically they're doing the minimum. They're showing up, they're punching the clock, they're doing their stuff. They're not really trying that hard, but they're not really like quitting, right? They're just kind of like, hey, pay me, I'll do stuff and whatever. And then you have, it's around 12-ish% where people are actively working against your results. And that actually, the cost of having somebody like that is 9 times the cost of a regular employee, which is absolutely insane. But it's what we all know kind of through our experiences. If you have a bad apple, it really impacts the whole team.
Mm-hmm.
The person's negative, they're pushing back on every initiative. Sometimes they'll be like actively working against it. So you go, hey, Tim, maybe we should do this change initiative. They're like, no. And then they drive people and they talk about it and they kind of try to push everyone back to the old ways, right? And so that's the data. And also the data shows that like high trust companies return 2 to 3% more in stock returns per year over a 26-year period. That's a huge number, right? And it's like that trust is built through great leadership, not through a boss that yells at you if you did something wrong, right? And so it's just getting back to fundamentals, and the leaders who are at the top, like we just need to change our mindsets. And especially now, like what I see a lot, Tim, and I'm sure you do as well, is like, oh, the market's uncertain. We're not sure about revenue. Let's cut people development first, like training budgets goes out, and then like consulting and all the other stuff goes out too. And it's like, we should still be investing in our people because that delivers a huge return when not only they feel like you care about their development, so they become more engaged. That's also a research-backed statement. But also now you have better people who have better skills, who can do things, right? That's a great thing.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point. Like you're speaking to the converted here in terms of companies investing in their people and the growth of people. One thing that I've noticed in a lot of companies is that investment's happening, but in the technical aspects. And of course, technical skill training needs to happen. We need continuing education, and we have to keep doing that for people in technical roles. And what we alluded to earlier is that gap in the leadership skills has to happen earlier. And I don't see it happening as much. And when it does, I'd say the biggest downfall is that it's a weekend retreat or a course or a program, and then it's Monday morning back to business as usual. There's no follow-up and what I call the long tail learning of integrating that information that they learned and reinforcing it. The stats on one-off trainings are just dismal in terms of retention and the application of those skills. So I often say to companies, if it's worth investing in, almost flip the ratio around and say, if you're going to invest 100% in training, take 20 or 30% of it and put it in the initial training, and then take the other 70 to 80% of it and use it for reinforcement throughout the program. And I often say that when I go in to do a keynote or a talk at a company, one of my first questions is, hey, why are we doing this training? What's the outcome? What's your desired outcome? Is it to check a box on your training thing to say, hey, we got this credential? Or is it to actually implement what we're talking about? Because if it's to implement, this one-off training is not going to be it's not going to solve the problem. We need regular reinforcement. They say in marketing, 7 to 18 times you have to be exposed to information before it registers. And so I guarantee that 99% of training and development programs aren't getting 7 to 18 touch points after an employee or a leader takes a program.
Yeah. And the data backs us up too, right? And so Harvard Business Review reports that companies spend $356 billion per year on leadership development, and only 25% of it is effective because it involves the leader's mindsets. And so, just like you're saying here, is if we want to sustain change, we have to change people's minds, because otherwise it's a 4-day. Then I have Friday off, weekend where, I forget stuff. And then Monday I walk into the office and my boss goes, hey, here's 12 more things that you missed last week. And you're back into that cycle. And so, like when we host our trainings, our programs, we run them for 8 to 12 weeks. Now, it's not obviously it's not full time for 8 to 12 weeks. It's an hour of content, an hour of group coaching, and then we also have some individual one-on-one coaching for each person. And it's spread over that amount of time is exactly that. I can teach you what emotional intelligence means in 30 minutes, but you don't learn it because you don't feel it and you don't practice it. And that's where that 8 to 12 week window is, where you're doing the reps every day. It's starting to become integrated into you as a leader. And that's truly what matters.
Yeah. And we're starting to see, obviously smart companies are implementing these things and seeing greater change. I'd say it's still a minority of organizations that are putting these long-term development models in place and really working with employees to get key metrics on how they're being implemented. And we see it a bit in the wellness side or the well-being side, as employee engagement surveys and things like that. Leadership 360s, when done poorly, 360s are a waste of time and absolute garbage, and they just disengage people. But when they're done right, they can be powerful tools for change if they're combined with a leadership development program and follow-ups. And that's, I guess, where executive coaches and leadership trainers come in to really fill the gap. But I've spoken with so many people that say, oh yeah, I did my annual review. And it's like, that's the last time we chatted about those things was a year ago. It's like, well, if a year between every major strategic touch point is the window, then you're going to be severely lacking in your ability to make course corrections along the way. And so,
yeah, and that's back to the, like what Gallup talks about are the 5 behaviors for engaging people. And it's having a caring manager, focusing on strengths, constant development discussions. I forget what the other 2 are, but it's basically that, right? It's like people want to feel, 1 is that they matter, 2, that they're cared about, and that they're focusing on their own development and utilizing their strengths so they're effective every day. And like literally I had a conversation with one of my leaders last week, and we were talking about being creative with his people on tasks. He had some folks that he was trying to give tasks to and they were pushing back, and it was like they weren't good at these tasks, or they felt in their mindset that they weren't ready to do them or whatever. And I was like, well, why don't we take some other folks, give them those tasks, and then hand the tasks that these people are good at to like cross-pollinate the work a little bit differently. And it doesn't take this massive effort, right? It's like, hey, Tim, this Excel spreadsheet data tracking stuff, like let me do that. And then you can work on, going out and building connection or going out and engaging people. And it's not this huge shift. It's a couple tweaks.
Mm-hmm. And going back to what we talked about before, about how there are so many bad bosses out there and people haven't had that training. They haven't had the coach sitting down with them and really asking them those challenging questions and working through that development process. I guess most people, I wouldn't say most people, there's a split between how people deal with a bad boss. The most common would probably be just quitting your job. But that's not feasible for everyone. So, what are some effective ways to stay in the role and hopefully make it better as an employee?
Absolutely. It depends what type of boss you have first, right? So when the 6 types of bad bosses, basically 2 of them are known as arrogant and violent and abusive narcissists. They make up roughly 25% of the workforce experiences those type of bosses. These are your Gordon Ramsay, Hell's Kitchen, throw the dish on the ground, yell at you, those kind of guys. I know he's not exactly that, and it's more a role, but it's for the point. Those folks aren't typically going to change unless they do a lot of therapy or they have this big moment where it's like the light turns on for them. Those are in your quit category, right? And also sometimes if HR is effective, you can also report their behavior or, those kind of things are also options for those. But typically you're just going to have to leave or find something new. Whether that's internal or external is up to you. Some of the ones on the other side, though, there's 2 types of bosses. That one is called the cowardly boss, and the other one's called the messy bosses. So the cowardly boss is these folks that go, well, that's not my decision. That's for upper management, or something like, you know what, Tim, you're the SME and you should decide, not me. Basically, they have a mindset where it's, I don't know if they don't feel good enough or confident enough or whatever, but they don't want to be accountable for decisions, so they don't do it. Then we have the messy bosses where it's probably just a training thing where they haven't learned necessarily how to delegate properly, communicate properly, set deadlines, instructions, clarifications, specifications. It's just sort of like, hey, Tim, you figure this out, right? For those bosses, you can actually manage them. And so it's like when someone just throws a project over the fence, it's like, well, Rob, you know what? Like, when do you want this done by? What are your expectations for the output? Can you tell me like what my budget is, or can I employ other resources from other departments, or, I need help with this or that, and like get them to sort of define for you a project plan. And you can teach them over time, right? As you mentioned, one time isn't going to be enough, but it's like over time, if you continue to ask these questions, they're going to learn, oh, well, Rob wants, Tim wants this kind of thing when I delegate work to him. And so that's what I'm going to do, right? For the cowardly bosses, they don't want to make decisions, but you can say to them, hey, Rob, I need support and I'm going to ask Tim to help me on this project. How does that sound? And it's more like you're asking them to agree instead of decide for themselves. And so you're sort of like telling them, in a way, you've decided, but you're telling them sort of like, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Is that good? And then they can, most likely, they'll just be like, yeah, that's fine. And so those are kind of the bosses you can coach in a sense. There's,
Essentially
yeah,
managing up.
absolutely.
Yeah.
The biggest thing I want folks to leave with this is, and also if you want, I have a free ebook on my website, howtodealboss.com. You can go there and it'll break out the boss types and some of the strategies. But the biggest thing I want folks to take away from this is you need to lead yourself. And so this starts with you deciding on what's acceptable and not acceptable, and then also how you're going to navigate. And it's just like the training, right? You need to take control of your career and go, I want to be whatever. If I want to be a leader, well, I need to get leadership training. Or if I want to be the best engineer in the world, well, I need to get continued development in engineering so I can do this. Whatever that is, you need to decide and invest where you need to, because your company is going to do stuff. And it's great if they kind of align, but often they won't. And that's where you need to start choosing for yourself, because that's where you're going to become your best.
Love that. And you bring up an awesome point that often gets lost by people who are facing toxic workplaces or bad bosses, is that they just, this is out of my control. I don't have any control over this. This sucks. And it's easy to get down in that negative spiral. Regardless of the situation, we always have control over how we respond to that situation. And even Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, I that reading that the first time was just this light bulb moment of, yeah, it doesn't matter how bad things get, because you can't, pretty tough to get much worse than his situation, and still to be able to choose to see the positive and to learn and grow and develop and keep control over the things that you have control over. That is critical to health, happiness, well-being, success down the road. And we are going to face tough times. We're going to face tough people, tough situations. Being able to take a step back and use that personal growth and the learning that we take away from it. One of the positive intelligence programs talks about the 3 gifts technique. It's like, whatever you're facing, what are 3 gifts I can take away from this? Learning, insight, and self-growth are just different ways to look at it. But I love that you said that. And thinking back to something I read from Brian Tracy ages ago was, every employee or every person is the CEO of their own personal services company. And so I love that approach and that mindset. And because a lot of employees, especially in the toxic environments, just say, whatever, I'm just going to do my thing and I don't have influence, but you have influence over how you show up. And as you said, if they're in a situation with that 25% of the bosses, quitting might be the best option. If you're being abused mentally and physically, then yes, leave for sure. It's not worth staying in that situation. But there are most situations are not that type of situation. So there are opportunities to improve and grow. And so I think there's so much of that can be helped. Now, hopefully, as you said, the people don't have to deal with asshole bosses, and that companies are investing in leadership training earlier. What would you say is the future, I guess, with so much awareness over the past 4 years since COVID, particularly? There's been a sea change in terms of the awareness around mental health in the workplace, leadership. Where do you see us being in 5 years?
So the first, I just want to go back right to what you just mentioned. And this is hard. Taking control of your life and career is hard, especially when you're in a toxic environment. And the stats prove that out, right? Is folks who work for a bad boss typically stay there 2 years longer than other people in regular jobs, right? And especially if you're in one of those ones where they're abusing you or they're attacking you, it eats away at your control, right? Your brain, like toxic workplaces increase depression 300%, right? Even your physical risk goes higher as well. So you're more at risk for major disease, heart attack, strokes, all these other things, right? And the reason I'm so passionate about it is I was there. I literally tried to kill myself. And then the next morning I woke up and I went to work. And I knew my workplace was killing me. I knew my boss was killing me. And yet my brain was like, well, Rob, you should just go to work because that's what you do. You got to make money. You got to be important. You got to be whatever, right? I could have quit my job.
Yeah.
I could have, like, it wasn't a money problem. I didn't have any, like, logistically, I could have, like, quit my job, got in my car and drove away, right? It wasn't that. It's the psychology that shuts you in. Mm-hmm. And the biggest part is for folks out there that I want to give to you is you can choose. And if you have a bad boss, I give you whatever power I have to tell you to quit your job and move, right? These are things that are possible. And it's just now we got to start implementing that because I know it's incredibly hard in the moment. I've been there. I didn't do it. But I want my experience to be something useful for you because I didn't do it. And I spent another, year and a half at that workplace and it was awful every minute. And I hope that me sharing that helps you get the resources you need to change and move and get out when you need to. Because ultimately, this is one thing my dad said to me is no job's worth your life. And that's 100% true.
And thank you so much for bringing the topic back to that of the psychological challenge of actually making that change. That is something I obviously didn't mean to minimize or skip over, and it's so important. And I've seen that in lots of clients I've worked with. I see it in myself. Some of the business challenges that I've had over the past is like when you get into that spiral, and how I explain it and describe it to clients is it's like a whirlpool. At the beginning, you're in this downward spiral, but it's slow, and it gets to this point where you get to a certain point and it's almost next to impossible, it feels, to pull yourself out of it because you're getting sucked down so much. And that's where, like you said, I can't even fathom how it would be to try to commit suicide and then go to work the next day in the same environment that was causing that. So
the piece, Tim, is that is actually the most common thing that suicide attempt survivors do, is their life doesn't change. We think that it's like, oh, we hit rock bottom, we move to the beach, right? Like that's what the movies tell us. But actually, that's not always the case. Like I didn't learn, like I spent 6 years after that just sort of drifting, trying to figure out what's going on, not really being engaged. And so it's like, I just want to give that to folks because it's like we're taught in movies, you hit rock bottom and then it's like a voice speaks to you and you're like, oh, I should become a leadership coach now. It's like, well, that actually didn't happen. It took me, 7-8 years to get to that point, right? But where it needed to go first was I needed to start going back into learning and growing, which I had cut off completely for about 4 years after that, because I felt every time I would try to read something or grow, I would get my brain would be like, oh, it felt like it was an attack on me, that I wasn't good enough, or I needed to take whatever advice I was listening to and implement it today and all of it. And like it was very hard for me to start doing that. But taking some of those small steps, going to therapy, getting a psychiatrist, getting a coach, surrounding myself with folks who supported me, that's when you can start doing things and then you can pull yourself out of it. And so definitely it starts with like like I think it starts with having that network. And like you mentioned, like that slow spiral is that's the point of having all these habits and the support systems in place, is that helps you never go down. Like, yeah, you'll have a dip. Like it's total everyone has dips, right? I have dips, you have dips, everyone has dips. But it's like when we're dipping, then we have folks who are like, well, like I literally have my wife, my therapist, and my coach go to me like when I start overworking, I have them watching out for me. And it's like, well, Rob, you did, 10 hours this weekend. Like, how are you feeling? Or, you've been working nights and weekends every day. How are you feeling? And it's like, well, I'm tired. I'm burnt out. I'm not feeling engaged. Okay, we need to work on, let's put some boundaries there. Right. And it's like, that's the importance of having those folks, because it's hard for you to see yourself.
Thank you again for sharing that. I know that will be valuable to lots of people listening. I've talked to a lot of leaders, particularly executive leaders, that are in that situation and they don't see a way out. I think when we talk about the mental health stigma, and while there's more awareness around it, there's definitely more conversation happening, which is good. I think in the leadership space, especially at the executive level, it's still pretty taboo to admit that you're struggling. What have you
I
seen
think
around
it's
that?
also like partly a generational thing. And like the Gen Z folks, like we worked with an NCAA team last year, and these girls were 18 to 22, right? And they were all talking about going to therapy. And I was thinking back when I was in college, and I was like, we would have never talked about this. Like it's just not even a thing, right? And it's like that's the hard part, right? And I totally was there, right? Like, but when I started getting depressed, I didn't walk in to a doctor's office to try to get help for 9 months. And I was trying literally everything. I like, running outside, more sunlight, getting like all the stuff that people tell you, right? But it was like I didn't want to be vulnerable enough to be like, I need help and this isn't working. And so it is hard, but ultimately the hard things are where you, exactly what you said, is where you learn. And also where there's opportunity for growth. And that's the big thing for leaders, is you don't actually have to tell anyone that you're depressed, except for a doctor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or even a coach, right? Like you can literally call me and I'll be like, we can sit down and talk about it. And like it's never going to leave the room. Like there's no one saying like, you got to come out to your whole company and be like, you know what? Well, yesterday I was so sad, or like I'm burnt out, right? Like you don't have to do that, but you need somebody, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, you need somebody who can help you with those things. And like that's why you have therapists. Like that's literally their job. And so that's where, if you're out there and you're struggling, like you're welcome to shoot me an email, Rob at Elite High Performance. Happy to sit down with you. But find those folks who can support you with those things, because that will change your life.
That so for you, what was the catalyst that got you to reach out for help and go to
Yeah, it was actually a friend
psychologists?
of mine. So I had worked, yeah, it was a friend of mine, and she was a social worker. And I was like, I was really struggling. Like, I had a lot of like very intense thoughts. And I was talking to her and I was like, I'm having these problems. Like, what should I do? And she was like, Rob, go to the doctor right now. And so that's what I did. Like, I actually drove to ER. I was in a small town, so it was like I didn't have a family doctor, but I drove to the ER, and then they, wrote me a prescription, and then they got me into therapy and group therapy and all these things. But, and I just want to say for folks, it took me a long time to find support that works. So just for folks, it's not like you're going to get the first pill and it's going to work. Typically, it doesn't. I actually did around 20 medications before I found one that was effective. And I also went to many therapists before I found one that was effective. And so just to put that out there, it's not like a broken arm where they just set it and put a cast and everything's great. It's very complex and there's a lot of ironing out that they need to do with it. And so you probably will have to ask many times.
How how did you feel through that process of, I guess, experimentation with trying to find the right fit for a therapist? What were some of the thought processes you went through?
Well, that was actually the reason why the 6 year dissociation happened. Was the first round of help I did, I don't know, it was like 10 different medications or so. And I saw a few different therapists, group therapy, all of it. And it actually, some of it made me worse. Like, it's literally on some of the medications, like SSRIs, especially, they say like in certain people, it increases your risk of suicide or it increases your risk of depression. And that happened to me. And so I actually, after about a year, I was like, I don't think I'm even helpable. Like, it's like, I don't think it's even possible for me. And so I basically stopped going to all of it. And then the second time around was in about 2019. And I did again, right? I did another 10 different medications and did a few therapists. And then it was actually finding kind of the new strategies that they have now, where it was like, and literally now, my psychiatrist and my therapist are incredible. And the biggest part that both of them did or do is they were constantly learning things and constantly saying, hey, like my psychiatrist, first session I walk in, he's like, hey, we do a genetic test to figure out what medications work for you. It's new, but, and I was like, here's $500, do it now. And it was like science. And then every time I would go see him, he would show me a new paper that he read about the treatment path that we were doing. And I was like, ooh, I like this because he's on the edge and he's learning and he's growing. And then even my therapist, like almost every other week, she would be in a new training course and she'd be like, I learned this. Do you want to try it? I'd be like, yes. And it's like those growth mindset focused people, those are the people. Like, they're always good. It's not like, and some of the other psychiatrists, like, you could tell that they haven't read a book in 50 years. And it's like, well, yeah, like it was great when you took your psychiatry degree in 1970, like, but we've come a long way. And I think that's the big thing for folks, and even for people out there, like if you're thinking, I mean, obviously if you're listening to this show, you're into development, but keep on that path and surround yourself with people who are also on the growth path.
Absolutely. And you just used a great example of leadership skills is tailoring the delivery to the team member or the client, knowing that you, with your engineering background, that you'd be like, yes, absolutely. You tend to think science-based and logical, and let's try new things and let's experiment. And so for them to present it to you that way shows their growth mindset, but also caters it to your learning style and your preferences. And great leaders do that. Well, Rob, it has been such a fantastic chat. And I know our topic sort of went a bit more to the mental health side, which is amazing because I think it's so important and it doesn't get talked about, particularly on the leadership side, as much as I think it needs to. Before we go, what's, we recap the top takeaway you think you want people to walk away from this episode and the number one action they can take?
Biggest thing for me is becoming your own leader for you. And this can be in your growth, investing in your growth. This can be taking accountability and quitting your job if you have a bad boss. This can be going in and trying therapy or getting a psychiatrist, right? If you're struggling with mental health. But it ultimately starts with you making the best choice for you in this moment. And obviously, Tim and I, we don't know what that is, but you have all the information. And so you can choose to do the best choice for you. And so get out there and do it.
Excellent. Well, and hopefully that some of those choices involve the support system around you for people that are feeling like they might not have as many options as they think. So thank you, Rob. I look forward to reconnecting. And where can people find you?
Yeah, well, the first thing is head on over to the Leadership Launchpad Project podcast, wherever you're listening to Working Well. Tim is actually going to be a guest on our show. In real world, I'm interviewing him in about 5 minutes. In podcast world, who knows? So check that one out. And then for all things bad bosses, howtodealboss.com. That's where the free ebook is. And we actually have a training program as well. So you're welcome to check those out. And then for all things leadership development, one-on-one executive coaching, head on over to elitehighperformance.com for all of that.
Wonderful. I'll make sure those go in the show notes and people can link directly to your sites. Thank you again for your time and your insight and for sharing so genuinely about your experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That wraps up another episode of the Working Well podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Which guests or topics would you like to see featured on the show? Message me through LinkedIn or on the contact page of timborys.com. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Tim Borys with Fresh Group and look forward to seeing you on the next episode.